Hello, hello, good evening everybody. Thank you for joining me for our Wednesday night class and our first class on the book of Leviticus. This is going to be an introduction sort of session. We're not going to get into the text just yet. We'll do that next week. So we're going to talk about some of the background stuff and some of the structural things and concepts that we need to have a good understanding of before we read the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus is probably the one that most people skip when reading the Bible. You know, you make the commitment, maybe it's a New Year's resolution. You make the commitment to read the Bible from cover to cover in 1 year, and then it's like about the beginning of February and you get to Leviticus, and you say, wow, I don't know if I'm going to get through the Bible in 1 year because of this book right here. And if you start reading it, you'll immediately see why. Most people get bogged down in Leviticus. It is a book that is of a nature that many people don't have a lot of experience with. We're not very familiar with it, and we can struggle to see why exactly it's pertinent, why exactly it is important for us to know anything from the book of Leviticus. Hopefully, us studying through it together, we can shed that kind of thinking and find reasons why it is actually important, because it is important, I promise you. It is actually so important that it has bearings on how we are supposed to interpret the rest of the story of the Bible. Leviticus does. So it is pretty important, and hopefully we can learn to see it in a different light than we're used to, and in that we will hopefully be able to be more interested in it. Because I'll be honest, reading through it is way boring. You don't usually say that about much of the Bible at all, but when you get to Leviticus, it is as if the most common thought is, man, this is really tough to get through because it's boring and it is repetitive and it is rather strange to us. And so hopefully our class will help with that. So Leviticus. In the book of Exodus, we saw the instructions for building the tabernacle, and then Israel actually built it. So Exodus has the instructions for building the tabernacle, but if those are the instructions for building it, Leviticus is more of the instructions for how to actually use it. And if use is the correct wording, I think you might be able to say it tells them how to operate in it and around it. Them being Israel and the priesthood in particular in certain parts. So it's the instructions for using the tabernacle. You could say it's the user manual for the tabernacle. It answers the question that was posed by the ending of the book of Exodus. You remember from a week ago, we talked about the ending of the book of Exodus and how it poses this problem that once the tabernacle was built, the cloud of God's glory occupied the tent of meeting, and it was such that Moses could not enter it. He could not go in. And so we have the big problem. How are they going to interact with God if, not even Moses can go in to meet him? In other words, how can the sinful and unholy people of Israel approach the sinless, holy God without being consumed? And the answer is, you'll find it in the book of Leviticus. Aha! So there it draws you in, right? In Hebrew, the book is called Vayikra, simply because that is the first word in the book. That's how the Hebrews named the books of the Bible. They named them, usually, just the first word or the first phrase that appeared on the scroll. And for lots of the prophets, that would be the prophet's name. But for other books, it would be a word or a phrase like Vayikra, which means he proclaimed or he called, because the first words in Leviticus are, he, the Lord, called out to Moses, and it goes on from there. So the Hebrew name for the scroll, which would be the original name for the scroll, is just Vayikra, which means he called out to. But in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the name is Leviticus. The Greek language doesn't have the V sound, so it uses a U instead. So Leviticus, and we translate it Leviticus. Leviticus or Leviticus means of or about the Levites, which is actually a common misconception. The book of Leviticus does not just apply to the Levites, and it didn't just apply to the priesthood either. By the way, not every Levite was a priest. It was only a certain family within the tribe of Levi that was the priests, Aaron's family. But the book of Leviticus was not only applicable to the priests, it was applicable to all of the Israelites. In fact, only about 20% of the book, because the chapters are all different lengths, is specifically written to the priests, to the Levites. And those chapters are chapters 8 through 10 and chapters 21 through 22. Those are specifically to the priesthood. All of the other chapters in the Bible are written to just all of the Israelites. And it's applicable to all of them. So it's a kind of a common misconception, the reasoning behind why we call it Leviticus. It kind of gives the idea that it was just for the Levites, and therefore it is even less applicable to our lives today. And in fact, that was not true. It was applicable to all of the Israelite nation, and in that it is probably more applicable than you think it is to our lives. Not in like we have to do these things that are laid out in the book, but the concepts that are laid out in the book are more applicable to us than you would initially think just based on the name. So before we begin talking about things like the structure of the book and when it was written, we need to get a basic concept that underlies the whole book in our heads. And that is the concept of God's holiness. The word holy simply means to be set apart or unique. In the Bible, God is holy, he's set apart from all other things because he is the sole creator of the world and the author of all life. You, of course, read in Genesis chapter 1 that God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning, but John takes it a bit further in John chapter 1. Let's flip on over there real quick. John chapter 1, he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God." And then verse 3, "All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that which was made." Or nothing that which was made was made. So, without God and the Word, who was God, nothing got made. So the only one who is responsible for things being created is God and the Word, but the Word was God, right? John says. So he is the sole creator of the entire world. That makes him unique, which is the definition of the word holy. So it makes him holy. But he is also the author of life, and he is unique in this role as well. If you look in Genesis chapter 30, you'll find an instance where Rachel, Jacob's wife, she complains to him and says, "Give me a child." And Jacob says, "Do I look like God? Am I God? I can't just decide to give you a child. That's up to God whether or not your womb will be open." He says, "Am I in the place of God? Am I God?" No, I'm not. Jacob is recognizing that he is not the author of life. And a similar but different instance happens in Genesis 50, where when Jacob has died, his sons come before Joseph, the brother that they sold into slavery to Egypt, and they plead to him that he be merciful upon them and not take his revenge. And what is the first words that Joseph says in response? He says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Joseph recognizes he is not the author of people's lives either. God is. So God is the author of life in that he decides if a person can bear children. But he is also the author of life in that he has power over life and death. Both Jacob and Joseph attest to this fact by how they respond to people sort of unwittingly challenging that idea. So he is holy in that he is the creator of the world and the author of life. And if God is holy, then the space around God is also holy. You remember in Exodus chapter 3, a very well-known passage, Moses sees God. God appears to Moses in the fire in the burning bush, and what does he say to Moses? He says, "Stop where you are, don't come any closer, remove the sandals from your feet, because the ground on which you walk is holy ground." Why was it holy? What is so special about that mountain? God was there. It is his presence that made it holy. Thus, the same goes for the holy place and the most holy place inside the tabernacle. It is made holy because God is present, right? And God's holiness is a good thing, right? It is purity, it is goodness, it is life, it's justice, right? It's all good things. But it can also be dangerous. How do I mean by that? How can it be dangerous while it is so good? Because in the presence of that holiness, that which is sinful and corrupt, that which is unholy, gets destroyed. I had to fix my microphone a little bit, it was making noise. Gets destroyed. Think of it like the sun. In our solar system, the sun is utterly unique, right? It is the only star in our solar system. It is also a very good thing. The sun fuels life on the earth, right? It radiates the energy out, and the plants soak it up and they store it, and then the animals eat the plants, and then other animals eat those animals, and everything gets to live because of the sun. But what would happen if you were to jump in a rocket ship and fly too close to the sun? You would burn up, right? You would get destroyed. Because whenever something that is destructible approaches it, it gets burnt up because of the intense heat. It's not that the sun is a bad thing then, right? Because the sun fuels life on earth. It's a good thing. But if you get too close to it, that which is destructible gets destroyed. That which is... This is making noise. I don't like it. Stop it. Okay. It gets destroyed. The same goes for God's holiness. God's holiness is a good thing. But if that which is impure, that which is unholy, that which is what's the other word that the Bible uses? Leviticus uses the word unclean, gets close to it, that which is sinful, corrupted, or unclean, impure, gets close to it, burnt up. This is annoying. We good? Microphone? All right, we're good. It gets burnt up. So, if Israel, who is unjust and sinful, wants to live in God's holy presence, then they too need to become holy. I'm just going to turn this off. They too need to become holy. Their sin has to be dealt with. Thus, the book of Leviticus supplied them with how they are supposed to go about that. Does that make sense so far? It's an important concept for understanding the book of Leviticus. And especially when we get to the structure of it, which, let's talk about that right now. The structure of the book of Leviticus is known as, the pattern is known as reverse symmetry. That means that for the kind of first half of the book, it goes through a list of topics in one order. So 1, 2, 3, right? And then you have a focal point in the middle, which is its own topic. And then the back half of the book goes back through that list of topics, but in reverse order. So 3, 2, 1. So 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1. And in the middle is this special focal point of the whole work. That was a very popular way of writing in the ancient world. Some of the Psalms have that kind of pattern, but one of the most popular, one of the most well-known examples of reverse symmetry in the Bible is actually the book of Zechariah, where Zechariah has 12, I can't hold up 12 fingers, I don't know why I try to do that. He has 12 dreams, and 6 of them descend through a list of topics, and then he has a sort of middle dream that's a focal point, and then the dreams resume with 6 more dreams, but they go back through the list of topics, dealing with them in a different sort of set of symbols, but going through them backwards. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then the book ends. So it's reverse symmetry. Leviticus, if you're going to try and draw this on a diagram, Leviticus has a reverse symmetry of three ways. 3 ways that God helps Israel to live in his presence in a holy manner, to make sure that they are holy and they are ritualistically pure, so that they can enter his presence without being endangered. Right? He gives 3 ways for them to make sure that they can do that. So section number, so that, like I said, three ways in the beginning, focal point, 3 ways at the end. So section 1, he deals with the matter of rituals in chapters 1 through 7, and they are sacrifices. And these sacrifices have one sacrifice that is specifically like a general sacrifice so that you can enter into the presence of God in the first place. And then 2 sacrifices that are a means of saying thank you to God. They are the grain offering and the peace offering. The grain offering to express gratitude for for being blessed. The peace offering to express gratitude that God is at peace with you. And then the final 2 sacrifices are a way of expressing that you are sorry for sins. One being the sin offering, which was between you and God, when there was a sin between you and God, and then the guilt offering, which was for when there was a sin between you and another person. So to violate the Sabbath would just be between you and God, but if you stole from someone, that's between you and that person as well as between you and God. So you would make the guilt offering as well. We'll talk about that more in depth when we get to those chapters. That's chapters 1 through 7. Section 2 is dealing with the priesthood. This is from verses 8 through 10, or sorry, not verses, chapters 8 through 10. It begins with talking about how the priests are supposed to be ordained, but it also includes a narrative bit with where two priests, Nadab and Abihu, who are Aaron's sons, enter into the presence of God in an unfit manner. They are drunk and they offer up, the Bible says, profane fire, strange fire, fire that it wasn't the sort of thing they were supposed to be using. And so they got destroyed. Just to, solidify in your mind that taking God's holiness serious is a serious thing. Then, section number 3, it has to do with purity laws. This is from chapters 11 through 15, and they have to do with ritual purity. And the main idea here is that, underlying idea, is that anything that is death or having to do with death, is connected to death, would contaminate you and make you unfit to enter into the presence of God. You would be, Leviticus says you would be unclean or impure. Those are the two words it would use to describe that kind of person. It also deals with certain animals that are considered unclean or impure, and you're not supposed to eat them, you're not supposed to touch them. But here's an important thing to understand. In the book of Leviticus, it uses the phrase unclean or impure to talk about someone who is not in a fit state to enter into the presence of God, the holy presence of God, and not get destroyed, right? If an impure or an unclean person were to enter into God's presence, they're dead, which is the whole thing that you're supposed to avoid. But to become ritualistically impure or unclean was not a sin. It wasn't wrong. Okay? These things have to do with, these things are things like touching dead people, If you have to bury your loved ones, you have to touch a dead person. Is it a sin to properly bury your loved ones? No. Therefore, it's not a sin to become ritualistically impure. Was it if you gave birth, you were to be considered ritualistically unclean for 2 weeks and also maybe 4 weeks if it was a girl? We don't get an actual explanation why the difference. But it's not a sin to give birth to a child. Right? And the list goes on. Lots of different things that make someone ritualistically unclean, but they're not sins. And it also wasn't really a big deal if you were made ritualistically unclean. You just had to quarantine yourself and take a couple of ceremonial washing sessions, and then you're back. That's it. So it wasn't as if you were socially ostracized for that, and it wasn't as if you were, no one thought that you were sinning by, burying your dead loved ones. That would be ridiculous. It's just that it was inappropriate, like severely inappropriate, to enter into the presence of God in an unclean manner. And while you are ritualistically unclean, because then you are in danger of His holiness resulting in your death. That would be way inappropriate. So it's not these things are sinful, but it's that these things make you unfit to enter God's presence, and you need to take care of that before you can go in. Make sense? Does everyone understand that? So, section number 4, we have the focal point of the book, and that is from chapters 16 through 17, and that is the Day of Atonement. We have purification offering and a scapegoat that's sent out of the camp. These symbolize the removal of sin and the consequences of it, or at least God's desire to remove sin and the consequences of it. You remember in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4, it says, "It's not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to erase or take away sins." It talk more about that in a little bit. God desires to get rid of the people's sins. Section number 5 has to do with purity again. Remember, now we're going in reverse order. Has to do with purity again from chapters 18 through 20. And these really have to do more with moral purity of the people. They were to care for the poor. They were to display a high standard of sexual integrity. And they were to promote justice in the nation. Sort of all the things that America has forgotten at this point. I'm just going to leave it with that. So section number 6 has to do with the priesthood again, naturally. And it is from chapters 21 through 22. And it has to do with the qualifications for being a priest and how the priests were to hold themselves to the highest standard of moral and ceremonial integrity. Hold themselves to the highest standard of moral integrity because a priest was God's representative to the people, and hold themselves to the highest standard of ritualistic purity because the priest was the people's representative to God. They were supposed to be the person who can, at any time of the day, whenever they're needed, be able to go into the holy place and make the sacrifice for the people. And once a year, the high priest, of course, went into the most holy place and made the Day of Atonement sacrifice for the people. So it was very important for them to hold themselves to the highest standard of moral and ceremonial integrity and purity, naturally. So the last section not the last section of the book, but section 6 deals with rituals again. This is from chapters 23 to 25, but this time it's not having to deal with sacrifices. Instead, it's dealing with festival days. The Jews before the book of Esther had 7 annual feasts that they were commanded to observe. And we're not going to talk about them in detail right now because that's for a later date. But they all have to do with remembering Israel's identity as a nation, where they came from, and remembering what God has done for them and how important God is for them as a whole nation. And really, when you consider how those two play together, they're really the same thing. So remembering their identity as a nation and remembering what God has done for them. And then the last section number, what are we at? 8. It's just an appendix kind of thing. The last 2 chapters, Moses calls Israel to be faithful to these guidelines, to these laws. And of course, if they disobey them, they would suffer the consequences. But if they obey them, then they will reap all the benefits that God gives them, the blessings. So, like I mentioned, Hebrews chapter 10 says a very important thing that will impact our interpretation on Leviticus and really our interpretation on the whole law of Moses and the sacrificial system therein. So let's read Hebrews 10, 1 through 10. The law, having a shadow of the good things to come and not the very image of the things, can never with the same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. For then would they not have ceased to be offered? For the worshippers, once purified, would have had no more consciousness of sin. But in those sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sins you had no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me to do your will, O God." Previously saying, "Sacrifice and offering and burnt offerings and offerings for sin you do not desire, nor had pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law." Then he said, "Behold, I have come to do your will, O God." He takes away the first, that he may establish the second. By that will, we have been sanctified through the offering of the blood of Jesus once for all. Once for all. So what is the Hebrew writer saying here in Hebrews chapter 10? Well, one, the sacrificial system in the law of Moses, which the book of Leviticus has within it, you remember the first section, was not sufficient, that's a way of putting it, to erase sins. To erase sins. Like he said, there was a reminder every year of the nation's sins. So, the effectiveness of this sacrificial system laid out in Leviticus was contingent on the purity and the sacrifice of Jesus the Christ. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, if there's this question that some people have, a lot of people have sometimes. If the old law and the sacrificial system was not erasing people's sins, then are they lost? Were all the people who faithfully followed what God said before Jesus came, before he was the sacrifice on the cross, are they just lost? Was that all for nothing? Did they all die in their sins because they weren't actually taken away? No, the effectiveness of that sacrificial system relies upon the sacrifice that Jesus was on the cross. The sacrifice once for all. All includes all in the present, all in the future, and all in the past. Important, in the past as well. Faithful followers of God before Christ came were justified by the Christ on account of their faithfulness in following God's law previously. Early church fathers would have said that they were, how to phrase this, they were Christians before Christ came. They would have said that about, Abraham, about Moses, about Aaron. They would have said they were Christians before Christ came. And so they faithfully followed God in the manner that was commanded of them at the time. And because they did that, their faith justified them just like how we are justified, which is by faith through the blood of the Christ. So they were ultimately covered by the same sacrifice that we are now. Do you see how that kind of connects the Testaments? A lot of people have this really inappropriate view of the Old Testament, that it's not important, and we only need to worry about the New Testament, and there's this hard line that divides the two, which in a way there's the moment where the new was inaugurated and the old was made obsolete, but there is the connection that is extremely important, and that is that Jesus and the ultimate sacrifice which he was on the cross is the end game of the old covenant system. It's not completely unrelated, it is deeply interconnected. So that is something to keep in mind. Let's talk about the time frame. The time frame that Leviticus happens in is really simple. It is a 1-month period between the book of Exodus and the book of the book of Numbers. And when I mean between the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, I mean it begins right after the book of Exodus ends, chronologically wise, and it ends right before the book of Numbers begins, chronologically wise. And this sort of helps to highlight again the big question that it deals with, the question that Exodus left off on in Exodus chapter 40, with Moses outside the tent of meeting, and he's not able to enter in because God's glory is filling it up. And then Leviticus, the first verse, is that now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So he is in there and Moses is outside. And then when you get to the next book in the Bible, Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses inside the tent of meeting in the wilderness of Sinai. So Exodus, he's stuck outside. Numbers, he's able to come inside now. The book of Leviticus worked. So, very good. Now here's a question that may wander in people's minds once we start reading the book of Leviticus, especially the first 7 chapters, and that is the question of, don't these sacrifices sort of seem a little barbaric to you? Don't these sacrifices seem a little barbaric? And, well, we might think so with our modern sensibilities, and 2, with the fact that we don't have to do those things anymore. And in reality, most of the world doesn't even practice such a thing anymore. There are some parts in the world that they do sacrifice animals still, but the majority of the world, no one does that anymore. So it seems barbaric to us because we are not in the context, the historical and geographical context, where such a thing is the thing that you do, right? Always remember that. The context is really important to take into concern when you are trying to figure out, like, what is up with this? The Bible is, 1, from the Middle East, and 2, it is from really, really, really long time ago. So we don't have to do these sort of sacrificial offerings anymore, and for the majority of the world, no one does either. But think about the context of the ancient world, and think about, in view of that, what kind of statement the book of Leviticus is actually making about God, about the one true God. You see, sacrifices in the ancient world were, it was the prime way to gain the favor of the gods, right? Let's say you're in Ur and you pray to the god, the chief god, you pray that he sends a bountiful harvest or whatever. And all of a sudden he sends so much rain that the river floods and hundreds of people get killed. What just happened? So in your mind, as a pagan worshiper of these idols, you're thinking, wow, I prayed that he sends a bountiful harvest and he ended up killing a bunch of people in my community. The gods must be very unpredictable and capricious. Because all I did was pray to him and he punished my community for it. So he must be very capricious, very unpredictable. But the book of Leviticus says God gives you a way to know. Like the book of 1 John, it says over and over and over again, I'm writing to you so that you will know that you have eternal life. There's no question about whether or not you're right with God because he gives you exactly how to know. If you have been doing these things and avoiding these things, hey, you are right with God. Come into his presence. But if you have not been doing these things, and you have been doing these things that he said not to do, you are not right with God. It would be your death to enter into his presence. That's what Leviticus tells people. That's what it is about. It is that they can know if God would strike them dead or not. It makes the statement that God, the true God, is not capricious. He is not unpredictable. He is not erratic. He is not illogical. He is not irrational. He doesn't just strike people or communities on a whim. Instead, you can know if you are right with God or not. And therefore, if you can safely dwell in His presence. That's a really great concept to have under your belt. That's a really great concept to get into your head. You can know. And the unpredictable, chaotic nature of the world doesn't reflect God's nature. Don't let that sort of thing fool you. It doesn't reflect God's nature. With God, you can know if you are right with Him or not, if you are suitable enough, if you are in the right state of purity or impurity, to enter into His presence safely. Which is why lots of places in the Bible it says that we boldly come before God. We boldly approach His throne. We boldly approach Him and call Him our Father. Why can we with confidence approach God? Because we can know if we can. And because of the sacrifice of Jesus the Christ on the cross to take away our sin and take away our impurity, we know that we always can. What a wonderful thing. And that's what Leviticus says. It says God is not erratic, He is not irrational, He's not unpredictable, He is not capricious. There is no shadow of turning with Him. You can know. Fantastic. People often skip over the book of Leviticus, like I said, for reasons which will become obvious when you start actually reading it. If you have tried to read it before, you know exactly what I'm talking about, okay? But it is actually of critical importance to really all of the Bible in general. It is the primary way how one who is following the narrative that God lays out for His people and His plan to redeem humanity, it's the primary way that you come in contact with the idea of atonement and purity and holiness and cleanness and being right and in a correct state to enter into the presence of God. It explains to you, by extension, the reason why sinners aren't going to be in heaven. Not sinners as in the context of we are all sinners, really. But sinners as in the context of those who have refused to take on the redemption that you can find in Christ. It explains to you in an indirect way, it takes a little bit of thinking, but it explains to you why no unrighteous and wicked person is going to be in heaven. Because that which is unholy cannot exist in the presence of the holy God. Thank you for joining me for this introductory lesson on Leviticus. Once we get into the text, I hope that we can carry forward this energy and this idea of looking at underlying principles and interpreting in such a way that makes it clear to us how we can apply things to ourselves. Because like I said, a lot of people get to Leviticus, it's a lot of laws, it's a lot of regulations, and it's a lot of things that don't immediately seem applicable to us. But if we can think about them for a little bit, and we have a heart to figure out what's going on underneath and behind the scenes also, we can make it more interesting and more edifying. That's a good word, edifying. Thank you for joining me this evening, and I hope that everyone stays safe and stays healthy. Please continue to pray for those of our number who are sick or who are stuck at home or have another otherwise thing going on that keeps them from gathering with us. Especially pray for Mary's daughter Donna. She is, as far as I know, still in the hospital. So please continue to pray for her and Mary and their whole family. All right. Thank you. Be safe. Be healthy. God bless you all. Have a good night.